curious quickly how you came to a different conclusion than everybody else.
Okay, good question. So let me go back a little bit in my own history. I graduated from college in 1963, and I got a grant to go out to the East-West Center in Honolulu to study Japanese. And so I did that. I then went to Japan, to Tokyo, studied at Keio University, got my master's degree at Keio. Long story short, I wound up spending part of the 1960s and a significant part of the 1970s in Japan.
During the economic miracle.
Yeah. And I spent that time, part of that time I was a student, but part of that time I was actually in business. I actually ran the Japanese subsidiary of an American company. I worked for a Swiss consulting company in Japan. So I was watching the Japanese miracle occur. I was participating in the Japanese miracle in the 1970s. And then in 1981, I was asked by Malcolm Baldrige, who was then Secretary of Commerce, to join the Commerce Department to help with negotiations with Japan. Now, you go back to 1981, you may remember that the Japanese auto industry was eating Detroit whole, that the Japanese semiconductor industry was beginning to eat Silicon Valley whole, that the Japanese had already conquered much of the steel industry, all the textile industry, all of the consumer electronics industry, and that our trade negotiators with Japan had been negotiating a series of so-called voluntary export agreements, under which Japan would agree to limit to a certain number its exports. So, in fact, in 1981, we signed a deal on voluntary export limitations with Japan on autos, and Japanese auto exports. The Japanese said, "We volunteer that we will not export more than," I forget the number, but around 2 million automobiles to the U.S. market. So Baldrige asked me to join the Commerce Department. I did, and I became the lead U.S. negotiator with Japan and also with Korea. And then I was the leader of the first U.S. trade mission to China in '82. But I had this experience with Japan throughout the 1980s as the key U.S. negotiator on all kinds of trade issues. And what I realized after a while was that there was a repetitive dynamic to our discussion. And here's the way it would go. We'd be sitting here in Washington, and some American industry, let's say the semiconductor industry, would come, and they would say to us, hey, we're getting killed by these Japanese. They're not playing fair. They're dumping products in the American market. They're stealing our technology. And can you, the Commerce Department, help us out? And so we, the Commerce Department, and the trade representative would go to Japan, and we would say to the Japanese, hey, guys, you got to stop doing this. You're cheating, and you're not playing fair, square. And the Japanese would say, oh, what are you talking about, man? The problem is we're playing fair and square. Hey, you know what? We have lower tariffs than you do. And they did. We have fewer border protection measures than you do. And that was true. So technically, if you looked at the U.S. and the Japanese economy, technically the Japanese economy was more open, quote unquote, than the U.S. economy. And so they would say, hey, look, our economy is more open than your economy. The problem is your businessmen. And your businessmen, come on, they don't try hard enough. Their delivery is always late. They put the steering wheel on the wrong side of the car. I mean, come on, And it didn't matter. It could be semiconductors, it could be cars, it could be almonds. It didn't matter. That was the debate. And I went through that, after going through that about 100 times, I scratched my head and I said, there's something wrong here. So here's the deal. We would go to the Japanese and we say, okay, what kind of a political system do you have? And the Japanese would say, well, we're a democracy, just like you. Oh, okay. We know how that works. And your economy. Oh, well, we're a capitalist market economy. Oh, okay, we know how that works, just like us. Uh, and but if you sat down and if you had experience in the Japanese economy and saw how it actually worked, and experience in Japanese politics and saw how it actually worked, yeah, okay, it was a democracy, but only one party had ruled Japan. Uh, at that point, only one party had ruled Japan, for the past 50 years. Uh, and you said, okay, it's a market economy, but it's a market economy in which 70% of the shares on the Tokyo Exchange never trade because of cross shareholdings between the major corporations. So you have the Mitsubishi Group. So Mitsubishi Autos, its bank is Mitsubishi Bank, and it's the bank and the other Mitsubishi entities are all linked together by cross shareholdings, and you have a very powerful bureaucracy. So I remember meeting with Akio Morita, the founder of Sony, at one point, and we were having a discussion about semiconductor industry. And Morita says to me, MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, must give them strong guidance. So there's a term in Japanese called gyosei shido, which means administrative guidance. And effectively what it means is that the Secretary of Industry or Finance or whatever it is calls up a CEO and tells him what to do. And the CEO does it. And why does the CEO pay attention to this bureaucratic figure? Because the bureaucratic figure is powerful. And the bureaucratic figure can cause the CEO just an eternity of pain informally. And the CEO is not going to be able to take him to court because it's all done behind the scenes and informally. And so effectively, okay, theoretically, the Japanese economy is a capitalist market economy. But effectively, it is a significantly government-guided economy. That was more true in the 1980s than it is today. And then just to add to that, if in the United States you're a mother or a dad and you have a really brilliant kid, and what do you want for the future of that child? Do you want your child to become, let's say, the Undersecretary of Commerce in Washington? Or would you rather have your child, let's say, be the CEO of Intel? Well, in the U.S., CEO of Intel every time, right? But not in Japan. Not in Japan. No. If you're in Japan in those days, you wanted your son to be a high-ranking official. That's where the prestige was. That's where the power was. And only secondary guys, only second raters would, go into Toyota or Mitsubishi or something like that.
I can really see why you're seeing
it
reflections of China.
It sounds very similar.
Well, it's interesting because in America, it's like Wall Street controls Washington.
Yes,
and in Japan, it's the polar opposite.
The polar opposite, exactly. And so, I had this experience in Japan. And on top of that, my wife is Chinese. She comes from a large Chinese family. Her uncle, at one point, was the biggest builder in the state of Hawaii. And I saw, how a Chinese tycoon ran his company and dealt with his people. And so I had some insight that most people don't have into, how China and East Asian economies and companies work. And as I got more involved with China, what I quickly realized was that China, in many respects, was Japan all over again, except in a way even more so. But before getting to China, let's just mention the tigers, because Japan had its economic miracle was formally announced in 1964, and the 1970s were kind of the really glory years of the Japanese economy. but then that they just sitting across the water was Korea, and the Koreans looking at Japan, and the Koreans know that anything the Japanese can do, the Koreans can do better. And so Park Chung-hee is sitting in Korea. They say, holy cow, these Japanese are making semiconductors and automobiles and steel. We're going to do the same thing. And so Korea adopts a similar policy to the Japanese. Taiwan, Singapore, they all basically adopt the same kind of export-led, mercantilist economic policies, and they all have miracles. And then China becomes the last tiger or the first dragon. And while most of the American analysts are looking at China and analyzing it in terms of the American, or let's say the Anglo-American economic model, and they're saying, oh, China is adopting market forces, and oh, China is going to allow private enterprise to be more active, and so they're going to be more like us. But I was watching it, and I was looking at the 5-year plans of the Chinese Communist Party and of the government, and I was talking to Chinese officials, and I realized that they weren't looking at the American model; they were looking at the Japanese model, and actually, not only were they imitating the Japanese model, but they were improving upon it, and they could improve upon it, because the one place where the bureaucracy had even more power than in Japan was in China. And so sometimes in Japan, for example, Honda was never supposed to happen. The champions for the Japanese industry, in the auto industry, for the Japanese bureaucracy, were Nissan and Toyota. And Honda was not supposed to make cars. But Honda was clever, and they managed to get into the auto business, largely because they had a big market in the U.S. To this day, Honda sells far more and makes far more cars in the U.S. than it does in Japan. But the Japanese bureaucracy turned out not to be powerful enough to strangle Honda. But the Chinese bureaucracy could do it.
I find it so ironic that, considering the anti-Japanese propaganda that the Communist Party loves, that they were so inspired by the Japanese.
You're exactly right. Chinese Communist Party loves the anti-Japanese propaganda, but even more, they love Japanese industrial policy.
Those communists love money.
Yeah, right.